Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name is Andrea Sterk, and I want to welcome all of you to our first annual History Honors Conference, the culmination and celebration of the first year of the History's Honors Program, now officially called the Distinguished Scholars Program in History. Before I say a little bit about this new program, and what our students presenting today have been doing over the course of the past year, I want to thank a few people who have made both this program and this conference possible. First of all, our chair in history, Sarah Chambers, who supported our efforts every step of the way. Howard Louthan, our director of undergraduate studies, and especially David Perry, who you'll see running around, our associate director of undergraduate studies, and history undergraduate advisor. And Dr. Perry worked hard with a team of staff to bring this conference to fruition. And that team included a number of people, but I especially want to thank Shannon Delahanty, who has been overseeing conference registration and announcements and has worked with me and the students to manage PowerPoint presentations, computers, and all things technical, as she will continue to do throughout the day. Shannon is sitting here. And also Dori, Catz, who will both be presenting this morning and is, among other things, responsible for the lovely programs for the conference. And if you didn't get one later when we take a coffee break, they're up there as you walk in. So let me say a little bit more about this program. So the History Honors Conference that you're participating in is celebrating the work of a year or more of undergraduate research and writing in the context of a new pilot program the History Department created in 2025. This program offers qualified history majors and non-history majors with a historically oriented research project the opportunity to pursue a year-long senior thesis, typically 30 to hopefully not more than 50 pages in length. And it should develop a clear and original argument and be of near publishable quality. And in fact, some of these theses will likely be published articles in scholarly journals. Now, while most students presenting today will not go on to careers as professional historians, and many of those presenting will be going on to graduate programs and careers in diverse fields, their project stands as a clear demonstration of their seriousness of purpose and their proven excellence in research. For many students, this will be the last opportunity to immerse themselves in the past and grapple with a significant historical problem and its significance. To participate in this program, students must apply, typically in the spring of their junior year. So this journey started over a year ago for most of the students presenting today. And to apply, students must develop a topic. They must find a faculty advisor with expertise in their area of research to mentor them. And they must submit a proposal that the advisor approves. Once admitted, most students begin their research in the summer or earlier. Some travel to archives around the country or abroad. Others pursue language study relevant to their project. And all of them work on relevant reading and research that helps them to clarify their topics and refine their questions. And then in the fall semester, they work together in a seminar, now called the Senior Thesis Workshop, which I had the privilege of teaching last fall. And they finish the thesis during a second semester, working independently with their advisor, but with the ongoing support of their fellow thesis writers. And in fact, while the program emphasizes independent study and self-direction, it also provides both a structure and a community for the completion of the thesis project. Participating students define their own topics, work one-on-one with faculty mentors, and spend countless solitary hours conducting research, writing, and revising. Yet we also offer systematic guidance and consistent support to each year's cohort. Students receive mentoring from their faculty advisors, the program director, research librarians, and graduate students, many of whom are here today. And they have also spent many hours reading, critiquing, and helping to improve each other's work. We continued to meet periodically in the spring semester, and students have practiced presenting their projects and getting feedback from their peers. Needless to say, they have formed close working relationships and friendships with one another. So it's a delight to have this opportunity to showcase and celebrate the excellent research projects of these 17 students from whom we'll be hearing throughout the day, the fruit of many hours of independent and yet also collaborative work. And now, before we move to our actual panel presentations, I'd like to introduce Dean GerShun of Avilez, the Dean of the University of Minnesota's College of Liberal Arts, who will offer a few opening remarks. Dean Avilez is himself a preeminent literary scholar and a dean who believes the liberal arts are about much more than academics. They're about equipping students to think critically and engage meaningfully with their communities. Now, deans are asked to speak at many far grander events than our relatively small history honors conference. So we're delighted and honored that Dean Avilez has made the time in his busy schedule to offer some remarks at the start of this event and to stay and hear a few of our students' presentations. So welcome, Dean Avilez.
Thank you all so much and good morning. You know, I often do have to speak at what you call grander events, but I was saying actually this kind of event, it means much more to me. This is why we're here. This is why we do this work, to be able to give you the opportunities to become scholars on your own. This matters more than when I go meet with donors. That's important too, that we got it matters, but this is actually the heart of the university. So even on a Saturday morning, so honestly, it's a pleasure to be here. So to all the students in the room, congratulations. Today is a milestone worth recognizing. The honors experience has asked a great deal of you. It's asked for intellectual curiosity, discipline, persistence, and the courage to pursue questions that do not always have easy answers, which I'm sure you know that already. It asks you to move beyond learning and what others have discovered into the challenging, rewarding work of producing knowledge yourself. That's no small accomplishment. I know there'll probably be families here over the course of the day, and for all the families, if they're here, if they're coming, I hope they feel welcome as well, because no student, no person works alone. If you, behind every researcher, I say that as a researcher myself, there's always a community of support. People who encourage late nights of research, listen to ideas in progress, offered reassurance during moments of uncertainty, and celebrated each step along the way. Thank you for the many ways everyone, families and mentors and faculty have kind of helped students to reach this moment to get to today. Today's conference is a wonderful reminder of what makes the study of history so vital. History is not simply, as I know I'm preaching to the choir here, history is not simply a study of the past. It's a study of people, institutions, movements, ideas, conflict, change, resilience, and imagination across time. It helps to understand how societies are shaped, how power operates, how communities endure, and how individuals make meaning in the world around themselves. So I have a degree in English, so I'm a PhD in English. I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and perhaps the most important class I took, though, although I'm a PhD in English, was actually a graduate course in history with Barbara Savage. That course, and again, I'm an English PhD, but taking that history course completely changed how I thought about doing research, working in archives, and it changed the kinds of questions I was asking myself as a literary scholar. And truly, I still feel this way. That course helped me to become a cultural critic in a new kind of way. So my point here is that history is not just for history majors. It actually is and needs to be for everyone. And we should all understand the importance of the study of past and how we write about and think about and approach the past. At a time when information moves quickly and attention spans are often pulled in many directions, historians offer something essential: careful analysis, evidence-based reasoning, context, and context is so important. Context and perspective. Historians teach us to ask not only what happened, but why it happened, who was affected, whose voices were amplified, whose voices were excluded, and what lessons we might carry forward. Those habits of mind are deeply valuable. The ability to analyze evidence, weigh competing interpretations, communicate clearly, and engage complexity with humility is urgently needed in every field. That's one reason why I'm especially proud of the opportunities available to the undergrads in CLA. We believe students should not have to wait until graduate school or later in their careers to participate in serious scholarship. Here, undergraduates conduct research, work alongside faculty as you've done, pursue independent inquiry, and contribute original ideas to ongoing conversations. I was actually at an event last night, the University of Minnesota Alumni Association, and I was talking to someone randomly, and we were talking lots of people are closet historians, people like me, who aren't historians, but we kind of pretend like we are. And I was talking to another closet historian, and we were talking about how important it is to have historians everywhere. Historians in public health, historians in the law school, historians in the public sector, historians in Congress. We need historians everywhere, not just in one place. The honors program represents this kind of commitment of thinking about research, but also the value of you all will go in many different directions when you leave here. This program represents that investment in thinking about the power of history everywhere, in every sector, in every space. To the students, one last comment. I hope you take pride in the final work you've done, and also it's okay if it doesn't feel like it's done. It never feels like it's done. I just finished my 3rd book, and I'm still like, is it really done? You have to kind of like let that go. It's okay. It's okay. We ask these questions for our entire lives, and that's kind of the fun part about it. So I hope you can take pride in the final product, whatever state it's in, and in the process that brought you here. The discipline, resilience, and creativity you've developed through this work will stay with you long after today. And I want to just take another moment to recognize the faculty who guided you all to get here. Mentorship is among the most important forms of teaching. And I think I can't imagine doing the work we do in higher ed without a sincere investment and cultivation of mentorship. Mentorship takes generosity, time, care to read through draft after draft after draft very closely, but also asking the right questions, challenging assumptions, and helping students really see what they're capable of and where the project could go in the future. Thank you all, faculty, for investing your expertise in this next generation of our scholars. The Department of History, as you know, has long demonstrated the best of what liberal arts education can be. It's rigorous, it's humane, it's connected to the wider world. In studying history, students learn that the world we inherit was made by human choices. And you also learn that it can be remade by human choices. That understanding fosters both critical insight and a sense of possibility. Again, for the families that are here or coming, I hope today gives you a glimpse into the remarkable caliber of students working. These presentations reflect not only academic excellence, but initiative, maturity, and intellectual ambition. And I cannot wait to be on the other side listening to these presentations. Before I close, I encourage everyone to engage fully in today, ask questions, make sure to really celebrate everybody's work and achievements. Be curious. I always say, I know I'm talking probably too much, but I think the most valuable thing you can do when you're in college, but even after college, is always maintain your curiosity. Always be willing to listen and ask questions. That is a gift I think that will always keep on giving. So be curious about how topics outside your own expertise, what they look like, what they could be. Conferences are not only about presenting finished ideas. I present at many conferences, and I don't go to a conference to kind of say, this is my idea and it's done. I go to conferences to kind of hear the engagement, hear new questions, to find out what I'm taking for granted and learn more. So I am very comfortable taking a very shaky draft to a conference in order to get that engagement and that thoughtfulness from people that I respect. And this is really the space you've cultivated here. So thanks for being here. all my words today are really to say thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting our students. And most of all, I want to congratulate all of you for being here, going through a year of this work. We're proud of what you accomplished. We're excited to what you've learned today, hear more about what you've learned today. And for those, because I'm mostly seniors, I'm excited to see you in a few weeks at commencement. Like, shake each of your hands individually. Enjoy the conference.
Okay, we are going to start in a moment with our first panel. And let me just say, the way things are working today is that we will have a panel where the papers that will be presented have been formed into panels on related topics. And each of 3 or 4 presenters in a panel will do their presentation. And then after the chair introduces each of them, and then at the end, the last 15 to 20 minutes, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. And I'm glad Dean Avilez suggested you engage. Take notes if you want. Think of things that you may want to ask more about. Clarification or comments are all welcome. So I will now turn things over to Tracey Deutsch, who will introduce our panelists for today. And if you can come up and sit here, and she'll introduce you one by one, I think. Yeah. There we go. You can stand up and introduce that. Okay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Can everyone hear me okay? I don't mind putting on a mic, but I'm also don't mind yelling. Okay. Thank you all for coming on this rainy Saturday morning, and thank you, Dean Avilez, for sharing those remarks with us. Thank you for supporting these students through their work. You all are testimony to the fact that history is not actually a thing you do all by yourself. I want to leave time for these excellent students to present their work and for you all to ask questions and engage with it. So I'm not going to say too much, but I am going to say that I am so pleased that this is the first panel, because I think these papers so powerfully reflect what we aim for as a department, but also as historians, which is work that is deeply researched, robust, informed by what the archives and our own interpretations have shown us, and that speaks to the present moment. History has never been as important as it is right now. And Dori, Nat, and Talia, I'm so glad to have you in the club. Welcome. I'm going to introduce people in the order that they're listed in the program. And I will introduce everyone and then let people take their turns and come up and speak. Talia Magnuson is a 4th-year history major with a minor in political science. She grew up in Minneapolis and became interested in the history of policing after attending a talk here on campus about the colonial elements of modern policing. A good indication that scholarly talks bring in lots of people. She is a recent recipient of the Hedley Donovan Scholarship, which she will be using this summer to expand on her capstone research. Next fall, she will be applying to graduate programs in history in order to continue studying British policing, its development, and its impacts on our modern understandings of justice. Dori Catz, do you want to wave, Dori? Dori hails from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and originally came to the University of Minnesota for theater. After a semester of exploring classes their freshman year, they fell in love with the history of policing sexuality, as one does, has been hooked ever since. Last summer, Dori was awarded the Donovan Scholarship and traveled to LGBT and police archives in California. This project is an extension of that research, which they are excited to share with everyone. Outside of school, Dori loves to watch police procedurals, knit, and spend time with friends, family, and most importantly, their cat, Mimi. While Dori is unsure about what will happen immediately after graduation, they hope to attend graduate school in history and further research this fascinating topic. I asked students to share their most exciting or surprising moment. Dori's most shocking moment of research was finding a Board of Rights transcript from a 1981 police hearing. And I think we're going to get to hear more about that. Nat Goodwin, do you want to? Nat returned to the U in 2024 to pursue a history degree after several years away. Since moving to Minneapolis in 2014, Nat has taken an interest in local history as a way to help understand our conditions in the Twin Cities. Outside of school, Nat works as a bartender and hopes to use this degree to find more opportunities to research and write about local history. And I have a feeling that will happen. Thank you all for coming. Take it away.
All right. Make sure
You can just click in. Yep.
we're good. Okay. Good morning. Policing is an essential part of how power is negotiated in modern societies. It's one of the points at which ordinary people interact with the state. For these reasons, policing studies allow us to interrogate power dynamics that are integral to our everyday lives and histories that impact us to this day. My research is about how civilian policing behaviors show up in 19th century London. The way that we think of police today mainly has to do with their role in the maintenance of public order. They are a central part, and often seen as the only part, of modern approaches to the maintenance of public order. However, the role of state-controlled police in this area has not always been dominant. In fact, for much of European history, the concept of police as we now understand it did not exist. But that does not mean that pre-modern Europeans lived in societies without order or security. Policing, which is to say practices used to enforce laws and norms of behavior, has long been carried out by people and groups that don't fit into modern conceptions of what we would now understand to be the police. Pre-modern European social order was greatly influenced by a complex network of power, including regional rulers, aristocracies, the church, and local leadership. However, there was also a thread of local community involvement throughout all of this. In England, early principles of civilian responsibility for community order, dating back at least to Anglo-Saxon times, laid a foundation for many centuries of local peacekeeping in the country. The Statute of Winchester, which was enacted in 1285, codified some of these principles, including watch and ward and hue and cry. Watch and ward stated that residents were obligated to keep watch over their town gates overnight and arrest any strangers. Although this system evolved over the course of the following centuries, the night watches created by the Statute of Winchester were still one of the main forms of law enforcement in London well into the 19th century. Hue and cry was another one of the most important and enduring principles of medieval law enforcement. It stated that if someone was accused of a crime, every member of the community must help to pursue and detain them. The Statute of Winchester as a whole laid a foundation for English policing law that centered civilian responsibility for security and order and persisted into the 19th century. The 19th century was undeniably an important time of change in Western policing history. The principle of modernization was proliferating throughout European society, no place more so than in England, and policing was deeply impacted by this culture. Police reformers in England argued that the capital city of London needed a new mode of protection for the modern age. Despite significant pushback against the expansion of state power, fears about crime and the political machinations of reformers like Robert Peel won out, and in 1829, the London Metropolitan Police was created. Robert Peel was the central figure in government police reform, and it was under his tenure as Home Secretary that the London Met was formed. This move transferred power over law enforcement from local parishes up to the central state government. The officers of the new police came to be nicknamed Bobbies and Peelers, and Robert Peel became known by many as the father of modern British policing. Now, early scholars of English policing saw the creation of the London Met as part of a natural progression toward an efficient, modern, and ideal form of law enforcement. They framed the pre-existing systems of policing as backward and insufficient to respond to the problems of a modern city. And they needed to be swept away by the new police, which would be professional and bureaucratically managed. In this view, 1829 marked a symbolic shift away from local and civilian law enforcement and toward professionalization. But the reality of policing in London was more complicated than these narratives imply. To begin with, there's plenty of evidence that parish leaders were taking steps to make their local night watches more professional and efficient decades before the creation of the London Metropolitan Police. But even more striking is the evidence of civilians continuing to participate in and take ownership of peacekeeping in their own communities at the very moment when reformers were decrying these practices as outdated and irrelevant. To explore this topic, I examined court transcripts from the Old Bailey, London's main criminal court, in the 19th century. By looking at the records of criminal trials from that time, we can get a sense of the city's policing culture and how ordinary Londoners responded to crime. My research uncovered evidence that official policing was not the only way that Londoners responded to crime. In fact, principles of law enforcement dating back to the Statute of Winchester can be found in the activities of civilians in 19th century London. I looked at 20 trials for housebreaking or home invasion from 1829, examining witness testimony to find my evidence. Of the 20 cases, 10 included descriptions of civilians tracking down or detaining suspects. 5 included neighbors or bystanders responding to an alarm, several times helping to detain a suspect. And 12 included some other form of investigation, ranging from questioning suspects and gathering information to searching for goods and evidence. Sometimes these were independent, and sometimes they were done in collaboration with watchmen and officers. Some of these cases included multiple forms of civilian involvement, and only 4 of the 20 cases did not have any examples of significant civilian peacekeeping behavior. This data shows that a significant portion of housebreaking cases included notable evidence of self-directed civilian policing. I've pulled several cases with examples of this behavior to show what it looked like in practice. Charles Templar was a London pub keeper who ran the Pied Horse, which I was able to find on this 18th century map of London. Today, it is a chain Japanese restaurant. Charles woke up one morning in 1828 to find his pub in disarray. The till was open with a false key in the lock, and money had been taken from it. His desk was gone entirely. A cupboard stood ajar, and inside lay a pair of stockings that did not belong to Charles. A taproom window had been thrown open, and a large piece of beef, which had been left in the side room, now sat on the pub's bar. On the window seat, Charles found muddy footprints. What could he do in this situation? Today, someone's first instinct would likely be to call the police, but Charles did not do that. He traced the footsteps across his own yard, over a wall, over a shed, and over an outhouse. His desk was found in a nearby stable. He and several others developed suspicions as to who was responsible, a 16-year-old named William Holmes, who was rooming at the inn. When another lodger, William Sears, saw the boy in town, he confronted him and brought him back to the pub. There, Charles Templar, William Sears, and a waiter at the pub detained and searched him, finding stolen goods on his person. This was when official law enforcement finally got involved in this case. A police officer was called to the Pied Horse, was given the evidence that had already been collected, and took William Holmes into custody. Henry Tilliard was another Londoner who demonstrated similar initiative to Charles. Tilliard returned to his house one day to find it broken into. The lock was removed from the front door, and a number of articles of clothing were missing. It's not clear how suspicion fell on John Woodison to begin with. He was the accused, but Tilliard stated that when he saw him in Hounslow Heath the next day, Woodison immediately began to run. Tilliard called out for two bystanders to stop him, and they did so. At the trial, Tilliard said that Woodison was secured and gave him a duplicate, which is a receipt given by a pawnbroker for goods. He then followed this to the pawnbrokers where he found all of his things. This story paints a picture of a man willing to conduct some of the most essential responses to a crime, starting with making note of details of the scene, then identifying a suspect, detaining the suspect, tracking down evidence, and finally prosecuting the accused. This case also shows an example of bystanders responding to a call for help, pursuing and detaining someone accused of a crime, which is an example of the medieval practice of hue and cry showing up in 19th century London. Another case shows a clear example of civilian action that was almost entirely autonomous from law enforcement. Joshua Newling was a tailor with a house in Stepney, where he lived and kept a workshop. He woke one morning to find 2 coats, a hat, and a pair of gloves missing from his front room. In their place, he found a pair of shoes that had not been there the night before. They belonged, he knew, to an apprentice with whom he had parted ways 3 weeks previously, a 19-year-old named Robert Nixon. The police were informed of the theft that very morning, but it was not the police who arrested Nixon. The next day, another tailor named Charles Beresford found Nixon in a coffee house and apprehended him on behalf of Newling. Together, Beresford and Newling delivered the young man to their local police office. In this case, it was not professional officers, but professional tailors who enforced the law. Now, I don't want to present these stories as acts of heroism. We lack much of the context necessary to make moral judgments about the people involved in these cases. Community-led law enforcement is morally nuanced, and it faces many of the same problems of abuse and prejudice that show up in state-run law enforcement. But it is important to recognize that law enforcement led by civilians is still a type of law enforcement. The idea that the state holds a monopoly on maintaining public order is simply not accurate. Looking back to early English policing history, in 1285 we have the Statute of Winchester, which gives us evidence of medieval traditions relying on civilian responsibility. In the 19th century, at the moment when modern, professional, state-controlled policing was making some of its greatest strides, ordinary Londoners were still claiming agency over peacekeeping in their communities. As for today, criminologists have for several decades been studying the pluralization of modern policing, demonstrating the increasing importance of private security, civilian infrastructure, and community participation in modern policing practices. My research demonstrates that this is not only a modern phenomenon. Instead, there is evidence of a continuous thread of civilian involvement and community responsibility that can be found throughout English policing history. Ordinary people have been participating in peacekeeping generally and law enforcement more specifically, even at the very moment when modern, professional, state-controlled policing supposedly took hold. Thank you.
Seconds.
Yay! All right. With that, good morning, everybody. My name is Dori, and this is my project, Homosexual Idiosyncrasies, Constructing and Policing Queerness in 20th Century Los Angeles. We're going to begin today with a story. On the evening of January 14th, 1981, Jerry Russell was arrested by undercover officers in the Encino Park men's restroom for lewd conduct. Normally, these charges would lead to a night in jail, a plea out in the morning. However, Jerry Russell was a sergeant in the Los Angeles Police Department and had been involved in a sexual situation with an undercover officer. In his appeal to his arresting officer, a man he knew personally, he pleaded, "Jim, you know me. I have a funny sense of humor. I don't know why I do these homosexual idiosyncrasies." Yeah. Russell was tried at an internal hearing known as a Board of Rights that June. I found Russell's story and the transcript of this hearing while digging through documents at the One Archive, an LGBT archive at the University of Southern California, where I'd gone to look for police documents to see how they described homosexuality. During my year of research, I investigated the history of criminalization and pathologicalization of homosexuality and the matrices of creating criminal identities. Police manuals show the official terminology of policing homosexuality, while internal memos demonstrate the uncensored emotions behind these practices. Finally, the transcript from this hearing demonstrates what it meant to do the physical work of policing on the beat from the point of view of officers themselves, as well as the unwritten rules they used to police for homosexual conduct. I argue that police were not interested in how individuals identified themselves, instead inscribing their views of deviance and masculinity onto policing of criminality. Now, before we get any further, I feel like I have to go over a term that we're going to be discussing today that a lot of people are not familiar with. Cruising, the act of clandestine sexual encounters in often semi-public places for men who have sex with other men. These spaces can be in public bathrooms in parks, in movie theaters, malls, amusement parks, piers, and tons of other places. The public yet private nature of these spaces and the high volume of traffic within them allow for a level of, anonymity without an announcement of sexuality, unlike entering a space like a gay bar. Participants who do not identify as homosexual often were referred to as cruisers. It is important to note that in the mid-20th century, many homosexual rights groups, at the time known as homophile groups, separated themselves both socially and politically from cruisers. This was in part because while homosexuals were identifying themselves as gay in many aspects of their lives, many cruisers separated the sexual act from the behavior, living outwardly straight lives. Speaking of identifying as a homosexual, we begin our historical context with the creation of the term homosexual by K.M. Kurtbenny in 1869, alongside the term heterosexual. With the creation of this term, homosexual became an identity category. In effect, the act of sodomy was a temporary aberration, while the homosexual was a class of person. In 1948, Alfred Kinsey published Sexuality in the Human Male, which presented data showing that sexual relations between men were more common than the public had previously assumed, and that identity was sometimes incongruous with that behavior. There were men who did not identify as homosexual who were engaging in sexual acts with other men. And in 1952, the American Psychological Association categorized homosexuality as a mental disorder in their first diagnostic and statistical manual, which is the main diagnosing standard for many medical professionals. While the medical field had pathologized homosexuality, the police state criminalized it using vice policing. Vice policing is typically concerned with two types of crimes: wrongs in themselves, including sex crimes, and prohibited wrongs, including gambling and substance use laws. The LAPD created one of the first vice policing groups in the country. This is from the Prohibition era, and later added a special group specifically for sexual policing. Due to the lack of federal anti-sodomy laws in the United States, the language describing homosexual acts and the punishment doled out for said acts varied nationally. While the aim of policing was to obtain felony charges for homosexual offenders, felonies required that the officers see individuals engaged in sexual intercourse. That's hard to do. Misdemeanor charges for public lewdness became synonymous with homosexual conduct charges, especially Section 647A of the California Penal Code, which was concerned with anyone who solicits anyone to engage in or who engages in lewd or dissolute conduct in any public place, in any place open to the public or exposed to public view. Because of that definition of public, which is incredibly broad and a bit ridiculous, it was often applied at cruising grounds. But where do police learn all this stuff? They don't just like pop in and they're like, hello, I know everything. Originally, officers were only taught at the academy. However, when William H. Parker began his tenure as chief of the LAPD in the 1950s, he wanted to make the department more professional, reeling from the reputation of Prohibition-era vice issues within the department. And part of that was done through continued training. From 1949 to 1952, the LAPD published the Daily Training Bulletin, a newsletter that offered tips and tricks on how to be a better officer. The advice ranged from standard professional behaviors, such as how to behave on the phone and properly testify in court, to crowd control techniques, gun safety, and how to prepare for natural disasters. It is California, they need to know how to do that. These manuals were then compiled into a book, which was published in 1954. Within the 274 pages of the book, the word homosexual is only mentioned once, in the chapter on arrests under a subsection on immoral behavior. Homosexuality is given as an example of immoral behavior alongside the immoral fondling of animals and attendance or performance at immoral parties. While in the 1950s, mentions of homosexuality were limited and vague in these texts, by the 1970s, entire sections of vice policing manuals were dedicated to the homosexual as a criminal class. In 1971, Prentice Hall, who later became Pearson, the math textbook publisher, published the Handbook of Vice Control as a part of its Essentials in Law Enforcement series. The 7th chapter, Sex-Related Offenses, covered the sex pervert, also known as the homosexual. The police were tasked with the goal of protecting society from the active, aggressive homosexual, someone not regulating the morality of private acts. This distinction separated the idea of the homosexual from this active, aggressive character, someone who is actively engaged in cruising and sought out sex with other men. And this distinction is furthered by this section, which has guidelines for recognizing active homosexuals. Some of these distinctions are based on actions, including giving the eye as a means of flirting. However, the individual's manner of dress and presentation, which does not concern sexual or flirtatious acts of the individual, but instead self-expression, such as wearing extreme clothing styles, using obnoxious language, and having frequent violent arguments with other homosexuals which result in slapping and scratching. The aggressive homosexual in this regard is not dangerous due to sexual acts, but as the manner of presentation, an affront to traditional masculinity. Training documents were not the only places where homosexuality was established as a criminal identity within the police department. Internal memos from the Los Angeles Police Department were also a site where these ideas were shared freely. The American Psychological Association, as we discussed earlier, reclassified homosexuality from a mental disorder to a sexual orientation disturbance in December of 1973. And the police were not very happy with that, because it meant they could no longer say, you can't work for us because you're mentally ill. So the Los Angeles City Council passed a non-discrimination ordinance which made it okay to hire homosexuals. Good. And this memo was a furious response. Unlike the Handbook of Vice Control, which describes distinctions, Between regular and aggressive homosexuals, the Vernon Memo made no such distinction, having issue with the hiring of overt homosexuals, as well as the behavior itself, stating, "Homosexual behavior is both illegal and immoral," in all caps. Policing of homosexuality was not only about the legal prohibition of sex between men, it was also about who was considered a man, and understanding the limits of gender, sexuality, and morality. In practice, officers did not only look for violations, but also for behavior they deemed deviant. The Board of Rights hearing transcript includes some of my favorite legal actions that were deemed suspicious, including the typical arrestee or arrest that's made there, being the park, is a result of an individual who drives up, sits in his car for a moment, pounds the park, gets out, walks to the restroom, tries to make eye contact with all the men in the park, enters restroom, comes back out. And I observed a lone male enter the restroom. He was glancing around at what I would describe as a typical homosexual type activity, seemed to be seeking eye contact. These are not illegal. So why does this matter? Well, despite what the Supreme Court has recently said, profiling is bad, and people are not inherently criminal based on outward appearance. By investigating how officers defined homosexuality in both themselves and others, we see the incongruities between homosexual identity and behavior, and how police imposed criminality onto people based on observable traits, not criminal activity. We are better able to understand the ways that contemporary police and other law enforcement officials are operating. While the work itself is specific to these men, the broader message against profiling still stands. Thank you.
Hello everyone. The seed for my thesis project was planted in early 2021, less than a year since the global uprising in response to the police murder of George Floyd. I was on Twitter a lot, I was watching local discourse play out over the movement to defund the police, and one word kept popping up in the endless arguments: Murderapolis. The word was most pointedly used in the context of Minneapolis' homicide rate, which spiked in 2020 and 2021, but it was also used as a more general anti-black dog whistle to describe the violent, criminal hellscape Minneapolis had supposedly become since the uprising and since the movements towards police reform or abolition. And the word was always used in historical context. Minneapolis had become Murderapolis again. So I wrote my thesis on the time in Minneapolis history when Murderapolis as a local descriptor was coined, in 1995 when the city's homicide rate spiked before returning to normal levels the following year. I focus on a crime prevention program called Minnesota HEALS, or Health, Education, and Law and Safety, which was spearheaded by Minneapolis-based corporate executives and which had the result of integrating and expanding policing infrastructure, partially using private funding in Minneapolis and in Minnesota. I argue that the Minnesota HEALS working group responded not so much to the crisis of violence itself, but rather to the Murderapolis narrative and its potential to trigger white flight, and in doing so actually exacerbated violent conditions for the communities most directly impacted by gun violence. While he was on a business trip in New York in the summer of 1996, the CEO of Honeywell, Michael Bonsignore, saw a New York Times article about Minneapolis' high murder rate the previous year. The article included the word Murderapolis and went so far as to say that t-shirts displaying the word were bought and sold by local residents. Bonsignore was disturbed by the article that painted the home of Honeywell's headquarters as a violent place to live, so he came back from his trip and he called together the governor of Minnesota, Arne Carlson, and some other executives from Minnesota corporations like 3M and General Mills. He made it clear that this problem was urgent and even implicitly threatened to take Honeywell out of state if it wasn't addressed. From this meeting came the Minnesota Heals Coalition that included corporate executives, state and federal attorneys, and leaders of local, state, and federal law enforcement to confront what they saw as a dangerous problem of specifically Black street gangs. Their goal was to bring stakeholders from both the private and public sectors together to solve the Murderapolis crisis, and Bonsignore's tagline for the program was, "The killing must stop." During the white political reaction to the Black Power movement a couple decades earlier, white politicians had devised a new guiding narrative of anti-Blackness, which was to tie Blackness to drugs and criminality. We can see this narrative described in detail by Richard Nixon aide John Ehrlichman in an interview in 1994. Quote, "The Nixon White House had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Black people with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." This narrative was very effective, and it helped kickstart the war on drugs, which continued through the 1990s. By the early 1990s in Minneapolis, it had taken root among the white populace. White homeowners were forming block clubs that partnered with the police to look out for criminal activity, and there was even a white nationalist movement taking root among Minneapolis youth, which had ties to the police department. At the same time, the drug economy in Minneapolis and across the country had grown throughout the 1980s due to loss of economic opportunities for the working class, and particularly the Black working class, in the shift towards neoliberalism and deindustrialization of the late 20th century. People in working class Black and brown neighborhoods were raising the alarm about growing violence around the drug trade. Then, in 1995, the homicide rate spiked, with a high concentration of both victims and perpetrators being Black youth. The narrative of dangerous Black criminals threatening the fabric of society reached a fever pitch, and the word Murderapolis took off. So there are two things happening simultaneously. There's a very real crisis of violence that's primarily affecting youth, and then there's a narrative of Black criminality that's gaining traction and power on both the local and the national stage. So first, let's look at the spike in murders itself. What caused it, and why was 1995 so uniquely violent? According to local historians, it was three interrelated things. Partly it had to do with the drug economy and the way it was policed using kingpin strategy, where police take out a higher up in a drug market and lower levels are left to squabble for control. This has been widely documented since the 1970s to worsen rather than solve conditions of violence, but MPD used it in the 1990s anyway. Another primary driving force behind the acute increase in gun violence among Black youth specifically was aggressive and racist policing. Minneapolis cops regularly engaged in aggressive anti-Black policing strategies, including racist harassment, baseless arrests, and police brutality. Between 1989 and 1990 alone, MPD had killed 2 Black elders, Lillian Weiss and Lloyd Smalley, and a Black teenager, Tysel Nelson. In a citywide report from the early 1990s about gun violence among youth, young Black people described the desire to feel protected as a common reason teens began carrying guns. This trend of aggressive, racist policing leading to increased interpersonal violence has been documented in places like Chicago and Detroit as well. Then, in 1992, a Minneapolis police officer named Jerry Hoff was murdered by young Black men, including one man who was affiliated with the Vice Lords, in an act of retaliation for police brutality against an elderly Black man on a bus earlier the same day. Following the murder of Hoff, MPD ramped up their anti-Black aggression even further, to the point that local historian Will Cooley characterized MPD's actions as low-grade warfare against young Black men. So these factors, all related in one way or another to aggressive police conduct, coalesced to create the conditions for the spike in violence in 1995. If aggressive and racist policing had on multiple levels driven the spike in homicides that triggered the Murderapolis narrative in the first place, what did the corporate and law enforcement leaders of Minnesota Heals think the solution was? Well, their solution was more aggressive policing strategies, and this only makes sense if you understand that Mike Bonsignore was not primarily concerned about the safety of directly impacted communities, or maybe about public safety at all. He was primarily concerned, by his own admission, about recruiting. His exact words were, "You used to be able to sell quality of life when trying to recruit people to work in the Twin Cities," and he complained that people had rejected job offers from Honeywell because they were concerned about safety in Minneapolis. So the driving concern of the leaders who formed the Minnesota Heals Coalition was not the very real threat of gun violence to directly impacted communities, which were also already being over-policed, as we have seen. Rather, the driving concern was the threat of white flight and the flight of capital due to the Murderapolis narrative of a once great city being overrun with criminals. Given that, what did Minnesota HEALS actually do? Although it was billed as both a community and law enforcement-focused working group, as the name implies, the community-based efforts of Minnesota HEALS were not publicized by Minnesota HEALS leaders as the primary accomplishments of the group. The largest such effort created 175 low-wage jobs in North Minneapolis, which did not even pay enough to qualify as living wage jobs by contemporary standards. The working group also created a smaller corporate mentorship program through Alina and Honeywell. But Minnesota HEALS was primarily a drive toward expansion and consolidation of the same police that had fostered violent conditions in the first place. These efforts included the creation of the Metro Gang Strike Force, a gang-focused interdepartmental police group that was disbanded a decade later over accusations of racial profiling, police brutality, and the illegal seizure of at least $18,000 in cash and 13 vehicles. Minnesota HEALS also coordinated private funding for the development of the Code 4 software, similar to the software that was used in New York to facilitate the stop and frisk program of racial profiling. Code 4 was quickly protested by local activist groups to no avail. And Minnesota HEALS led to the increased participation of federal agencies like the ATF in street-level policing and in home visits to people on probation, and to more coordination in general between different factions and levels of law enforcement, which helped break down what some police had seen as turf battles between different agencies. The combined effect of these strategies was intended to let targets know, according to one Minnesota HEALS member, quote, "We know who you are, we are in your home, we are checking to see how things are going, and we want you to know that if you are involved in any violent activity, we will bring the full force of not just the state, but also the federal government down upon you." Nowhere in Minnesota HEALS documents or public discussions I came across in my research was there any criticism of the policing strategies or police conduct that were crucial to escalating violence in the first place. It would be difficult to trace any statistics solely to the efforts of Minnesota HEALS, as it was just one group, albeit a powerful one, within a larger and more complex political landscape. But Minnesota HEALS definitely had the effect of increased collaboration and information sharing between different levels of law enforcement. The prison admission rate in Minnesota increased 75% in the 3 years following Minnesota HEALS' inception, and by the year 2000, with the Code 4 stop and frisk software in use, arrest rates for black people in Minnesota were 9 times the rate for whites. So given the importance of the term Murderapolis to the national press coverage that triggered the creation of Minnesota HEALS, it's important to ask who came up with the word in the first place. It was this man, Mark Koshelski, longtime owner of local gun shop Koshelski's Guns and Ammo. He's the one who began printing and selling the t-shirts discussed in the New York Times and other national publications that read Murderapolis, City of Wakes in 1995. According to the Star Tribune, the t-shirts were largely purchased by Minneapolis police officers. A couple of years after the Murderapolis fever pitch, Koshelski was asked by the Star Tribune how he felt about his role in kickstarting national press coverage. He said, "Actually, I feel pretty good. It helped bring attention to what was going on in Minneapolis, and it brought attention to my shop." As his word picked up traction, Koshelski recalled that firearm sales at his shop reached new heights. For a white gun store owner, both the crisis of violence and the narrative he created of it were all upside. So why does this story matter today? In 2020 and 2021, in the midst of local crisis and economic downturn, there was another spike of murders and carjackings that primarily impacted working-class black and brown neighborhoods. And like in 1995, many white people responded to something that did not primarily affect them with anti-black rhetoric. In 2022, a new program emerged to target carjackings, which were regularly making headlines at the time. The program was called Minnesota HEALS 2.0. It invited back previous Minnesota HEALS members and sung the praises of the original program, promising to throw increased police resources at the problem of auto theft, primarily impacting black and brown neighborhoods, despite the police killings of 6 black men in the Twin Cities in the previous 2 years alone. In popular discourse, there's often an implicit false binary. If you're critical of the violence of the police, you must not care about other types of violence, and if you're impacted by or concerned about other types of violence, you must be uncritically grateful for the police. The history of Minnesota HEALS demonstrates the pitfalls of this binary and the importance, particularly under conditions of structural violence like those in Minneapolis, of scrutinizing who is offering solutions and whose problems those solutions are really intended to solve. Thank you.
you all. We can open it up for questions.
Great job, you did it on time.
I'm so impressed. These presentations are really, really fantastic, so congratulations on the really great work that you've done. All three of you talked a lot about masculinity, which was really interesting and kind of refreshing, honestly, in histories of policing and, in Dori's case, sexual policing. I'm curious how you guys think about that across your project, if you could just sort of speak about the gendered aspects of what you saw in the archive, and especially this idea of kind of constructing criminality too that comes from that. I felt like I saw a really clear picture of the police force as like a masculinized state apparatus. So just curious about that.
Who was supposed to start?
I think you're supposed to
I think I was supposed to start. Okay. I found very few instances of women in these vice policing operations, and when they were there, like as officers. And when they were there, they were often sexual decoys in the same way that the men were. I didn't get into that too much today, but I found that a lot of the concern with homosexual officers was in part that they were not man enough to do the work. And even if they were masculine, that was not enough because the gay sex was the not masculine part. And so I found it to be a space that asked for a homogenized heterosexuality in a very interesting and gendered way in the language, mainly talking about manpower, and just literally seeing how there are so few women, and then also a lot of the aggression against homosexuals in policing is directed also at men. So it's a very man-to-man atmosphere. There are some women involved, but some of it, they were like, it's hard to police lesbians. We don't know what lesbianism is. And I'm like, I know. You don't know what women are. But then also their policing of transness was still very masculinized. In the reports, they're writing things like, man in dress and wig and lipstick and heels who claims he is a woman. And you're like, okay, that's a woman. Y'all are just dumb. So it was a very, very, like, assumed masculinity, and then the deviance of masculinity was often cited as part of the crime.
Yeah, it wasn't obviously the focus of my research, but there is I think one of the most interesting ways that masculinity shows up in the policing and the civilian policing of the 19th century is this idea of both householders and then like sort of the protection of your castle, and the idea of the Englishman's castle being his home. I was sort of looking at the expansion of that idea, that like you're not just protecting your home, you're protecting your community, but that's definitely a very gendered concept throughout English history, English policing history, that, I mean, obviously traditionally these were roles that were associated with men, that you're a householder, you're the man of the house, and that's what gives you this responsibility. But also in the primary sources, in the court records, you do see women engaging in these same behaviors, sometimes to really extreme degrees. This wasn't in my court records that I was looking at, but this was, I believe it was a newspaper article at the time that was written by these two women who went to extreme measures to protect their house. They shot into their back door, and then they drew targets around the bullet holes to show that they were good shots, so that when people came to attack their house, they would be scared. Things like that. So it's definitely not confined to men, but it's a highly gendered concept for sure.
I mean, I think, yeah, a couple of things struck me. First was the representatives that were chosen to be the faces of the police in the Minnesota Heals Coalition. They mainly chose women, which I thought was interesting. But and at the same time, there was this like obviously very racialized, simultaneous like aggressor-victim thing that was going on. The way that the police were positioned in the early 1990s in a lot of the archives that I found that led up to the creation of Minnesota Heals was police talking about how they just didn't know what was happening and they just didn't know how to handle it and they were afraid and but at the same time, people were being killed frequently and by them. So yeah, I think that's the main thing that I found.
And maybe folks can identify themselves when they ask a question. Yasmin.
Hello, I'm Yasmin. I appreciated the way that all three of these projects spoke to the public and private, and public as the space where actions and behaviors are sort of surveilled and observed, and the private as well. I'm going to accept Dean's invitation for context and curiosity. In the first two, I was curious about how, if at all, race played into the language that was sort of emerging, right? So thinking 19th century London, right, and thinking about colonization perhaps. I'm also thinking about Marx and sort of the writings that had sort of emerged as an observation with capitalism and even enslavement sort of on a broader context. I'm thinking about California, right, so like coming out of the 60s with the Panthers, and the ways that the state, you have 67 where suddenly now Reagan wants to ban guns, right? Or enforce stricter gun laws. And I really think, Nat, you spoke to the ways that, and you used neoliberalism, right, in your presentation. So if at all, did you see any impacts on capitalism or racism impacting the ways that policing sort of showed up in your work? And fantastic, I was scribbling and making notes, and now I'm going to go to 1285 in London and thinking that I've never done before. So I appreciate your work so much.
Yeah, I think that the way that both race and capitalism show up in a lot of my research, it's very implicit in this time period. Although I'm sure you wouldn't be hard pressed to find extremely racist language in the court records. I didn't come across any in the ones that I looked at, but I think that it's along, when you follow that path of the identity of the Englishman, that's sort of where you find a lot of that, where you can follow that same path, that same theory of who this Englishman should be, who counts as an Englishman, who counts as a householder in these discussions. There's certainly, in terms of like capitalism and class and all of that, these are highly loaded concepts. The people who were most adamant and most aggressively engaging in civilian policing were by far the upper middle class. And that's not to say that there aren't any examples of like lower class people doing somewhat similar things, but there were much more organized and well documented initiatives from upper middle class Londoners trying to get the police to do more, and then also going outside the law to police their own communities. So that it's a hugely loaded concept as well in both of those regards.
I am going to start with class and then move to race. I found that with class, the idea of who's even in these spaces is heavily classed. A lot of the men who are using cruising sites as opposed to gay bars have less capital, and that is a social security thing of if you are out and you lose your job, it's a bigger problem than if, like, a lot of the men who were in these homophile associations, for instance, were upper middle class, had higher social standing, and were white. And I think that that's something I wish I touched on a bit more in this, is whiteness is assumed as the standard and non-white people are assumed as already deviant. And so when policing for sexual deviance,
there's already this level of who is a man that is inherently white from these officers who are often like, this is around the same time that SWAT is being created in Los Angeles. The police chief at the time was very into heavily armed and brute force policing, and that was mainly against Black communities who were assumed to be already criminal. And so this assumption of criminality is heavily race-based and class-based. So when they are then going into these spaces where there are white men doing things that are deemed deviant, it's almost this personal like offense of how dare you. And so then in the policing, especially the case I found where they knew each other, oh, there's a lot of like very loaded language about like, you know me, and like ideas of who someone is, and these separations of identity and behavior are very, very specific to that.
I mean, I think, yeah, the neoliberal turn is hugely relevant to my project, both in what was being done and what wasn't being done as far as like solutions were concerned. You know, I think it's like there's the exclusion of a large portion of the working class and their simultaneous criminalization happening, and at the same time, I used a lot of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and she talks about the anti-state state, yeah. You know, and so it's like some of the more like like community solutions were much more piecemeal. They were they were not holistic in the way that the expansion and consolidation of the police state as a means of like managing this excluded portion of the working class was being consolidated. Yeah, so I think it was very much a product of the neoliberal turn and the war on drugs, you know, same thing.
I also just wanted to make a connection. I think there's a parallel between Nat's research and mine about this idea of who's being policed, that in my research I also found a lot of examples of the people who are least policed are the most interested in engaging in policing behavior and responding to this feeling of being attacked, even when they're the ones who are least affected by the crime itself and by the policing. Right. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Hi, Elizabeth, here in the history department. Really great panel. I think awesome individual pieces and really well crafted, and kind of watching this evolution of kind of the introduction of policing all the way to kind of, you know, very specific groups within the civic community kind of demanding more policing. So I guess, and kind of building on Yasmin's public-private question, thinking about kind of the rhetoric and maybe the training, because like such detailed training manuals there in the middle of the 20th century. Kind of ideas about kind of, you know, how do you see kind of rhetoric, particularly maybe here in the early, like the 19th century, kind of convincing people that this is the institution or the methods, especially when you have people who are like, well, we can do the investigative work ourselves and just bring you them, like the accused. So kind of, where did you see kind of rhetoric or training throughout that kind of evolving, the police handling how they inserted themselves into the community and made themselves this kind of necessity?
Yeah, I didn't get into a whole lot of like actual police materials. That's how the project started. I was going to be looking at that. But a lot of what I saw about this sort of like convincing people that the police was necessary was based around the transfer of power from the parishes actually to the central government, to the Home Office and to the new police. Because that was really what was the norm. It was expected that these things were being controlled by parish vestries, and a large part of the reason for the transfer of power there was because of the vestries felt ill-equipped. They didn't have the funding that they felt they needed to sort of answer these questions of like modern efficiency, and then Robert Peel basically convinced everybody that it would be cheaper to have the central police. It was not. It was actually more expensive. But by that time it had already been passed and it was created. But that was a big part of it. It's hard to find people talking in explicit terms about civilian responsibility and and the transfer of power in that regard, but there was one interesting quote that I don't remember exactly, but it was from a parish vestry that talked about the centralization of police was removing, it was like removing the father from the house or something. It was like, it was that they saw policing as their responsibility. This was their family, you know, that their parish was their family and they had responsibility to watch over it. And they saw that as an abdication of that responsibility. So I don't know if that fully answers the question, but that's mostly what I saw in the sources.
We do have a quick remarks, then we're going to take a coffee break before we move on to the next panel.
I'll go to the fast. I studied training manuals. They are loaded and riddled with why we need police, and both, I also was looking at, and it's not discussed as much in this, training manuals that were teaching people that gay people were people too, in the 1970s and 80s, and all of them are, well, the police are required, it's just what they do is different, but there is never a question in any of these documents that they are not a necessity.
Thank you.